If the microphone is on, and it sounds like it is, then I'd like to begin. I'm just going to stretch things out a little bit as others are coming in. So I'm not saying anything important. You can just fall asleep for a few minutes, but, well, maybe not. Let me see. I hate to sound like a promo, but I have 4 different biblical tours that I regularly lead, and I have 2 of them coming up in the spring. I know with COVID, everything is kind of up in the air, but I have a trip to Israel and Jordan in April of this year, and a trip to Turkey in May. And so if any of those trips are of interest to you, then email me, right? Some of you have my email in that handout. And by the way, that handout is far too small. That's there. I mean, so if you can't see the thing, and I don't blame you without a magnifying glass, then send me an email if you can at least read that and say, you know, Jeff, would you please send me the PowerPoint file right now? So I can read it on my computer or print it out with big letters, and I'd be happy to share those notes with you. All right, so that's the second thing. A third thing I can do, as I'm just kind of stalling for time, is I'm happy to know that there are a lot more people here than who are here. In other words, there are actually living, breathing brothers and sisters who are watching this online, and I've gotten some emails from a number of them, right? So you may not got that, but I was kind of encouraged. One, just that others were listening, and actually they all said nice things, so that's kind of nice too. So I want to welcome those who are here in body, as well as those who are watching online, not only contemporaneously, but also a number of them are watching it recording. So anyway, that was my stalling. We're kind of here, we're kind of settled, and I hope we're ready now for week 3 of 4 weeks. The broad theme, the gospel comes to Greece. The gospel comes to Greece. And the first week, the gospel came to Philippi, and last week the gospel came to Thessalonica, and you can see from the heading, tonight the gospel is going to come to Athens. So before I read the text, just the backstory very quick. I know what it is. I hit the wrong one. There we go. That was the last slide. Here's the first slide. So this is the second missionary journey, right? Second missionary journey, if that means anything to you. And they all start of Antioch. You can see it over there on the far right side, I guess. Antioch of Syria. And it starts off with just 2 of them, Paul and Silas. And then they quickly are joined with the young guy, Timothy. And they go up to a place called Troas. And they're picked up by a 4th guy, Dr. Luke. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. The 4 of them sail and land in Philippi. The gospel comes to Philippi. That was week 1. I'm sure you remember everything I said about that. And so you'll remember that, of course, that Dr. Luke is left behind, right? They say goodbye, and that leaves again the 3 musketeers, the 3 missionaries, Paul and Silas, the head guys, and young Timothy. And they go down the Via Egnatia, the Egnatian some way, you'll remember. And they came to the second place we looked at. The gospel comes to Thessalonica. And that was last week. Paul gets run out of town, and he and Silas go to the next town. You can see it on the map, maybe not so big, but Berea. And Paul gets run out of Berea, and we're going to see that Silas and Timothy are left behind, and some brothers take Paul, almost certainly by boat. You can see the blue line going down the Aegean Sea, and they bring him to the place we're going tonight, to Athens. All right, so that's the backstory, and now I'm going to read to you the account. And I have to live up, I'm afraid, tonight a little bit to my high school nickname. Remember, Motor Mouth, because remember the first week, lots and lots of verses. How will I ever get it done in time? I did. I don't know how I did. Last week, I could slow down. There were only 10 verses. Praise the Lord. It was so nice to be a little more relaxed last week. And this week, I'm kind of in between. I've got 19 verses. 19 verses. So in order to get done in an hour, and remember, we're already kind of starting a little late, and to save some time for questions at the end, I have to live up to my high school nickname of Motor Mouth. So here we go. So I'm going to remind you of the text, and then we're going to spend the rest of our time explaining the text, hopefully leaving a little bit of time for some questions or observations. So first of all, let's remember what the Bible says about how the gospel came to Athens. And it goes like this. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happen to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean." All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands, and he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did that so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. Quote, "For in him we live and move and have our being," as some of your poets have said. "We are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead." When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." At that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. If I can make it there, I'll make it anywhere. It's up to you, Athens, Athens. No. So, what is the purpose of the text we're looking at tonight? Well, from Luke's point of view, Athens has a reputation, it may not match reality, but Athens has a worldwide reputation as being like the pinnacle, the highest and most impressive place of knowledge and learning and public speaking. And Luke wants the readers, that is you and me, to realize that if the gospel can make it in Athens, right? If people in the smartest and most impressive city in the ancient world are convinced by the gospel, well then, if it can make it in Athens, it can make it anywhere. That's exactly right. All right, so that's the big meta purpose of this story about the gospel coming to Athens. Now, it's important for us to look at the structure, the outline, right? There are 19 verses, I said to you, and so the first six, S word, the setting, the background, what's going on when the gospel came. And then we get 10 verses. This text is actually quite famous. Why? Because this is Paul's sermon to a very particular crowd. And so we'll talk a little bit about that 10-verse sermon that Paul gave in Athens. And then we're going to end with 3 verses with another S word, but the final or ending scene, right? How did this story turn out? So Nice three-part message, and I said that not because all messages have to have three parts. It just so happens that when I looked at this story, they've got these three parts. So we're going to begin with the first S, and that is the setting, the backdrop, the backstory, right? Before we finally get to the sermon, and then finally the results, what happens at the end. So here we go in the setting. So we started off by saying, those who escorted Paul brought him to Athens. I gave this a little bit before the reading. In your mind, you can look on the map. I want you to see Paul in Berea. In Berea, after being run out of town in Thessalonica. And the Jews who gave Paul a hard time in Thessalonica went to Berea and gave him a hard time in Berea. And so the Christians said, Paul, it's not safe for you or for us, actually, for you to be around. And so they brought him, the text doesn't say where, but they brought him to the sea almost for sure. And they didn't just bring him to the sea, they actually seemed to sail with him to the city of Athens. And they kind of dropped Paul off in Athens, and Paul said, well, send word to my other two musketeers, right, my other two missionaries, whom I left in Berea, right, Silas and Timothy, tell them to join me, quote, as soon as possible. So where is Paul? Well, he's in Athens. He's in Athens by himself, right? Now then the text says, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens. Who are the them? Well, those are his fellow missionaries. And so while Paul is alone in Athens, what does he do? Well, let me go back for a minute again. He goes for a sightseeing tour. Well, wouldn't you if you were in Athens? The city with its glorious reputation, with all of its impressive buildings and history, wouldn't you go on a sightseeing tour of Athens? Well, I think so. A lot of people go with me to Greece and still go there on a sightseeing tour in Athens. And so Paul is walking around Athens, and we read, well, first of all, before we get there, I already suggested to you, right, that Athens was in reputation, no longer in reality, but in reputation, it was considered like the pinnacle of human achievement. I have an ancient source from Cicero. I'm not going to take time to read. You might look at it later. If you can't read the fine print, remember, send me an email. I'll send you the whole file. I have another ancient source from Pliny the Elder, but I'm going to read the modern scholar, F.F. Bruce, who said this. Athens continued, right? Even in New Testament times, Athens continued to represent the highest level of culture attained in classical antiquity. The sculpture, wow. The literature, wow. The oratory of Athens in the 5th and 4th centuries BC have indeed never been surpassed. In philosophy, too, she, that is Athens, occupied the leading place in all these fields. Athens retained unchallenged prestige, all right? So again, in New Testament times, people had heard about Athens, and all they heard was like, wow, and impressive. But I just tell you, it didn't match reality. All right? Now, of course, hardly anyone knew that because people can't travel around, and it wasn't like a documentary that you could watch on how Athens has lost its former glory, right? So I want you to realize that in Paul's day, Athens was maybe 15 to 20,000. Maybe it doesn't mean much, but last week when the gospel came to Thessalonica, and remember, you have everything I said last week in your mind. I know that. I said to you, 80 to 100,000, right? And next week, if you come, the gospel will come to Corinth, and I'll say like 100,000. And so Athens, despite its glorious reputation, is far smaller than Thessalonica and far smaller than Corinth, right? But again, Luke knows that the people of his day don't know that. It has that glorious reputation, and Luke wants to show the readers how the gospel can make it in Athens. And if it can make it there, doggone it, it can make it anywhere. You shouldn't dismiss this story. You should pay attention. If all these smarty pants people and impressive people found it convincing, you probably should too. Now, Paul goes on this sightseeing tour, and Luke says that he was, quote, not just distressed, but greatly distressed. And why was he distressed? Because he saw all kinds of idols. Now, Luke is not exaggerating. If you would go to Greece, and you can go with me sometime to Greece, right? Why not do that? Anyway, still today, I would take you to the Acropolis, that high part. What would you see there? You'd see a temple to Athena, the god of wisdom. You'd see a temple to Poseidon, the god of the sea. You'd see a temple to Nike, the goddess of victory. You'd see a temple to Artemis, the god of hunt and wood. You'd see Dionysius, the party god, Asclepius, the healing god, Augustus, the Roman emperor, because they were worshipped too. So just on the Acropolis, there were all kinds of idols. And then I would take you to the lower area, to the Agora, and I would show you the temple, I think on the next slide, there it is, the impressive temple of Hephaestus. Isn't that impressive? He was the god of metallurgy, like working with steel and so forth. You'd see Ares, the god of war. We're going to talk about him in a minute. You'd see Zeus, the head god. You'd see Apollo, who's known for a lot of things and so forth. So Luke is not at all stretching the imagination when he says that Paul sees lots and lots of idols. In fact, I have a source here. I can't read them all, but Petronius in the ancient world, this is satire, right? So it's it's maybe stretching things a little bit, but he said, if you walk around Athens, there are so many gods in Athens. I mean, you have every chance of meeting a god if you walk around than you do people. That's how many gods are in Athens, right? And we read that Paul was, again, what? Not just distressed, but greatly distressed. And the verb here is an Old Testament verb that describes God when God looks at his people of Israel. And some of you know the story of Israel pretty well. There were times when they started worshiping other gods, right? I mean, they started worshiping Baal and so forth. Anyway, in one of those texts, it talks about God looking down at his people. They're guilty of idolatry, and he was greatly distressed. I mean, it's the same thing. I mean, it isn't like God's like just a little bit bothered. I mean, this is a deep concern, a deep kind of pain, that God has when his covenant people are wandering away from him and going after other gods. And Paul has this visceral negative reaction. And that should make sense to you because remember, he's a Jew. And remember, every Jew, well, even Christians today don't know Hebrew can say, Shema Yisrael, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is. So if he's one, that means there are no other gods, right? And so actually, if you're a Jewish person and you think about Gentiles, all right? So you're a Jewish person, you're not, just imagine for a minute, right? And you think about Gentiles, you kind of roll your eyes and go, we all know what Gentiles are like. There are two things that all Gentiles are guilty of. I mean, okay, one is porneia, sexual immorality, and the other thing, of course, that all Gentiles are guilty of, and it's true, it's on the screen, idolatry, right? Because, I mean, there's a God for every aspect of life. I mean, you can't get by in life unless you make sure these gods are happy, right? How can you be successful in business? How can you stay healthy? How can you make sure bad things don't happen to you? There are gods for everything, and you've got to pay attention to them all. And anyway, so it's not surprising that Athens is full of idols. Paul sees that, and he's not, I mean, he would have seen similar things in other cities, not as intense, not as great, but Paul sees it, and he has this visceral negative reaction. He's really upset. So what does he do about it? Well, the first thing he does is he goes to the synagogue. And you say to yourself, well, of course he does. That's what he did in Thessalonica. I mean, almost every town has a synagogue. You only need 10 male Jews. And so Paul went to the Harvard School of Judaism. Remember we talked about that? And it was easy for him to have a ready-made congregation. I mean, why go out to the streets and try to drum up a crowd when you got a crowd already ready-made for you in the synagogue? And he just names drops like, I trained at the feet of Gamaliel, right? Wow. Would you preach for us? I mean, we'd love to hear from you, right? And so Paul regularly went to the synagogue, okay? And so that was certainly part of it. But then he also went to the marketplace, In Greek, the word is agora, open space, agoraphobia, right? In Latin, it's forum. You may not remember, but Philippi, what am I saying? You, of course, remember everything, right? 2 weeks ago in Philippi, I showed a large, open, rectangular area down below. I said that was the agora, or the forum. That's where Paul was dragged in front of the city leaders, charged with casting, with other things. And then last week in Thessalonica, I showed you a corner of one, and some of you may remember, I said, we're lucky we had that because they were going to turn it into a parking lot, and it was kind of safe, right? Every city has one of these open areas, and of course, Athens does too, right? You see it? But wait a minute, you're saying, Jeff, that doesn't look very open. Okay, and you're right. You know what happened? In open agoras of especially prestigious places, like Athens. I already told you Athens is a prestigious place. Anybody who's anybody in the ancient world says, I would like to fund a building project in Athens, And of course you want it, you got to put it somewhere, right? And so you want to put it in the only open space it has. I mean, it would be like Bill Gates, okay, over here, and he wants to do something, and he does do a lot of good things, but he wants to build a building, okay, and he wants to put it in the mall in Washington, okay, right? He probably couldn't pull that off, right? But I mean, if you're going to do that, you want to put it in a public space, and everybody will see and know, right? And so in Athens, the open space over the years, right? All kinds of rich, important people from all over the world wanted to fund building projects, and so the open space got filled up after a while. Does that make sense to you, right? So then the city says, well, we better create another open space where real business activity can take place. So anyway, in Paul's day, these are the buildings and more actually that would have been there. So Paul's in this open area here, right? I mean, there's some buildings in the middle now, but Paul's in that marketplace and he's preaching the gospel. Make sense? So he started off in the synagogue. He's doing some stuff over there, but synagogue is maybe, I don't know, maybe they're meeting every day. They're for sure, having services on the Sabbath, the Saturday, but during the week, he's going to this agora. And while he's there, two groups of philosophers discover him and want to give him a hard time. Now, you need to know that the Epicureans and the Stoics hated each other, okay? So you've got two philosophical schools who are mostly spending their time fighting each other, okay? And they're in Athens because, remember, it's reputation. So if you want to kind of be influential and shape public opinion, why wouldn't you be housed in Athens? And so you got these two different philosophies, and they're always fighting with each other, but they see another person come along, and apparently they're so bothered by Paul that they join forces, okay? And they start attacking this newbie guy who's got you know what I mean? We're gonna roast him, get rid of him, and then we'll go back and fight each other again like we've been doing forever. So what do they say about Paul? Well, we read they began to debate him, and then, they have two responses. You ready? And I've got a D word. I love alliteration, right? So the first response is derogatory, right? And the second one is dangerous. So the first thing they have is derogatory. What do they say? What is this babbler trying to say? Now, this word or verb, babbler, actually refers to a bird in the ancient world, okay? And this bird would apparently eat a food inside a seed, but it was trapped inside the seed. So the bird would go down and get the seed from wherever, will go up high and then let go of it, right? And it would fall on a hard surface if they were smart, right? And it would crack open and then they would eat it, okay? And so they're calling Paul this kind of bird. Why? Because they say, and they mean this in a slammy kind of way, Paul doesn't have any original ideas of his own. He's just like a scavenger bird, picking up all kinds of seeds or ideas, right? And then he just deposits them in other places, okay? One scholar would translate it this way: Paul's a mere vulgar plagiarist. I've published 6 books, and if you say I'm a plagiarist, I'm going to be mad, right? Because you just slammed me, right? I mean, it's not a nice thing to say, is it? Another person translated, Paul's a third-rate journalist. I mean, it'd be a slam even to be a second-rate journalist, but he's a third-rate journalist, okay? So we've got these two philosophical schools who normally are, duking it out against each other. They join forces, and the first thing they slam him, they embarrass Paul, right? I mean, remember, honor, shame in the ancient world. They're shaming Paul, which is actually a really bad thing to happen. But then they leave the derogatory thing and they do the dangerous thing. They say, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. And that's a dangerous charge to make. Because you remember everything I say. You remember 2 weeks ago, I'm just going to go over here for a minute, when we were in Philippi, okay, right? And anyway, I had some slides there where I said that you couldn't just practice a new religion, it had to be approved. In fact, you know, some of they said charges against Paul. They said they're advocating customs that we Romans are not permitted to do, right? So it's a dangerous thing because it's illegal. All right? That's what we talked about 2 weeks ago. And another reason it's dangerous is there's a guy named Socrates. Have you ever heard of Socrates? Yeah, he was kind of famous in the ancient world. Everybody knows about Socrates. Everybody knows that he was killed in Athens. And guess what he was killed for? Because he was rejecting the gods that were accepted, and he was introducing some foreign gods. So Socrates was killed for the very thing that Paul is charged of doing. All right? So 2 things that these philosopher enemies were saying. The first one was a slam, derogatory, shameful, and the second thing was dangerous. So then they took him and brought him to the meeting of the Areopagus, the Areopagus. Now here, don't lose me, because there's a couple of language things between Greek and Latin that I think you can understand, but just to make sure you don't get confused. So there's a Greek god of war, Ares, right? And pagus is the word for hill. So Areopagus means the hill of war, right? Or the hill where the god of war is, okay? But remember, in New Testament times, the Greeks aren't in charge, even though we're in Athens. The Romans are in charge, right? And so Ares, the Greek god, has a Latin, parallel, right? And his name is Mars. Mars is the god of war, right? Okay. And remember, Pagos in Greek means hill. And so Areopagus in Greek becomes in Latin Mars hill, all right? I mean, you've heard about Mars, so I'm going to say something about it in just a minute ago, all right? So they bring Paul to the Areopagus. They bring him to Mars Hill, so to say. And there's a bit of confusion because Mars Hill, the Areopagus, is both a place and a thing. Areopagus is both a place and a thing. So on the map, you see I wrote on there that big barren rock, I wrote Areopagus. Because you can go to there today and people will say, oh, here's the Areopagus that's mentioned in the New Testament. That's the place. I'm not actually so confident that the thing, what is the thing, Areopagus? It's the highest court in the city of Athens, all right? So it's like the ruling elite, okay? And so we don't have any actual strong evidence that they met up there. Okay, they likely met down in the agora or the forum. But we don't have to worry about that. Wherever they were, whether they were on the Areopagus, on that tall barren rock, right, okay, where actually you take your life in your hands when you walk up there today, you can still do that. You could say, I was where Paul was, right? It was in the Areopagus. And just forget the fact that I don't think it happened there. It happened down below in the place where they met in the agora. But somewhere in this area, they brought Paul to the Areopagus. They brought him to Mars Hill, all right? And he was charged then, right, with this advocating foreign gods, which Athenians in the past had killed Socrates for. So yeah, Paul's in a vulnerable spot. So this is not a polite inquiry. The Greek says they took him, and the Greek has more the sense of they seized him, right? It wasn't like, oh, Paul, let's escort you, and it's a big happy thing, and we have a nice little open discussion. It's more like they almost seized Paul. They grabbed Paul and brought him and raised these charges against him. Now, I'm going to come back to Mars Hill in just a second, I guess, but I'm going to save that for the sermon, all right? So remember, we're still in the setting, the 6 verses. Then I have to do the 10 verses of the sermon and the 3 verses of the closing. Okay, let's finish up. We're almost done the setting. So they said to Paul, may we know these new teachings that you're presenting. You're presenting some strange ideas, okay? And so Paul has an opportunity, and again, I've suggested to you, it's not just like we're curious, inform us, but wait a minute, you're saying some suspicious and dangerous things, and we want to explore it a bit more, and depending on what you say, you might pay a price for it, all right? Oh, good. So we finished with the first part of our text, the 6 verses of the setting. And now we're moving to the 10 verses of the sermon. The sermon. So our passage has three things. Don't get confused with the point I'm going to make now. There are three big sermons in the book of Acts for each of the missionary journeys. First missionary journey, Paul has like a big sermon that Luke records. Like there are other small ones, but a big one that Luke records. The second missionary journey, a big sermon that Luke records, and a third missionary journey with a sermon of Paul that Luke records, right? We're in the second one. The first one happens on the first missionary journey in Asia Minor in a different Antioch, not Antioch of Syria, but Antioch of Pisidia. And the audience is different for each of these three. The audience in big sermon number one are unbelieving Jews. Okay? So if you want to know how Paul would preach to unbelieving Jews, go look it up there in Acts 13. Look how long it is, right? A long sermon, right? And you can get a feel for how Paul would preach to his fellow unbelieving Jews, all right? I'm going to skip the second one. We're getting there in a minute. The third missionary journey happens in a place called Miletus. Maybe you know the story. Paul summoned the Ephesian elders, and so the audience in the third sermon are Christians. Okay, so a friendly audience. And Paul has a particular theme for that. Excuse me for a minute. But now in sermon number 2, that's where we are. Second missionary journey in Athens. What's the audience? Not Jewish unbelievers, but Gentile unbelievers, pagan unbelievers. You with me? So Paul's sermon to unbelieving Jews, right, is probably going to be different than the sermon we're looking at to unbelieving pagans. Aren't you interested in the two? And what's more, where did this take place again? At the Areopagus in Greek, which means in Latin, Mars Hill. So a lot of preachers in North America today, there's one in particular you probably heard about already, Mark Driscoll, right? They say, we should be like Paul. We're not going to be wussy Christians and just hide at home. We're going to like boldly go right to the most pagan of places, boldly proclaim ourselves as Christians and then proclaim the gospel. We're going to be like Paul. And so they give themselves a name to reflect that mentality. They're going to call their church Mars Hill, right? And Mark Driscoll, I'm mentioning to you because, well, there are a number of Mars Hills churches, tons of them, but he had a big one, a really big one that collapsed, right, in Seattle. But surely you know that on my way to church here tonight, right, on McDonald Drive, right, Trinity Church, guess who's there? Mark Driscoll. Don't you know that? He's right down the street from you guys. You don't even know that? Okay. I go by there and I'm like looking at this church. I think, what are they doing over there on Wednesday night? Like even during COVID last year, they had like all lights on and all kinds of things. And I thought you'd be interested in that. Anyway, Mark Driscoll, right? Original founder of like the biggest Mars Hill, right? Because Mars Hill is that mentality. Like Paul, who just kind of boldly went into the heart of paganism and presented the gospel. And then what I'm saying is a lot of people are interested in this sermon of Paul because they say, well, we should learn from Paul, right? I mean, if I were going to preach to unbelieving Jews, well, then I'll look at Paul's model over there. But if I'm going to preach to unbelieving pagans, well, let me look at the gospel comes to Athens, and maybe I can follow the same strategy. So I'm just kind of highlighting this sermon now, this 10-verse sermon that we're looking at. Okay, well, Paul's not stupid. He starts off by complimenting, right? You win your audience over by saying something positive and nice. And Paul says, people of Athens, I see that in every way you're very religious. I mean, that's a good thing. It's good to be religious in the ancient world, right? Because that means you're worshiping all these gods. You're doing the right kind of stuff. And so the people are like, okay, I guess so far this guy is pretty good, right? And then he says, as I was walking around, I looked carefully at all the things you're worshiping, and I even found an altar that said, to an unknown God, right? I have to go quick over this part just because of our time. The idea is probably one or two things. One would be, you've got all kinds of altars to all kinds of gods, right? Okay, but then you say to yourself, what if we missed one? I mean, he or she would probably be kind of ticked off with us, right? Okay, and we're spending all this effort to please all the other gods. We don't want to, so why don't we cover our bets and put one more out there? That's one way to think about it, okay? You laugh, but I'm somewhat serious about that, right? Okay. Another way to think about it is altars may have been made a long time earlier, and then maybe the religious site gets maybe neglected, or maybe there's an earthquake and something gets destroyed, and well, I'll give you an analogy. When was the last time you threw out a Bible? When was the last time you went and took a Bible in your house, went to the garbage can, lifted it up, and threw it in there? Maybe never, right? I mean, maybe you got like 12 Bibles at home and you never used like 10 of them, but I mean, there's something sacrilegious about throwing a Bible away, right? Okay, somewhat similar. You have to imagine that, you got all these, got altars, okay, and maybe like, maybe broke off the inscription, or at least the key part, like, well, where did this from originally? You know what I mean? And we're just a little reluctant to kind of just chuck it away, okay, right? And people either forgot or it was damaged with the name of the god or goddess, and so as a result, okay, this is an altar to, I don't know which god it is, okay? It's to an unknown god, all right? Anyway, Paul sees that, and he uses it as a hook. Like a speaker might suddenly break out in song, like, from Frank Sinatra, and say, kind of a hook to kind of get the audience, okay, right? And so Paul kind of uses this as a hook. He says, I'm walking around, and you guys got an altar to an unknown God. I said, well, okay. And he says, guess what? I know who it is. I'm going to explain this unknown God to you. People are like, well, I'm interested in that. That sounds good. So what does Paul do? He says, so you're ignorant of the very thing that you worship, and this is what I'm going to explain to you. Now, Paul begins with a number of words, I don't have time to really expand this, that talks about God's transcendence, right? So Paul begins by giving a picture of like a really big God. I mean, God is so big, he doesn't need you. Right? I mean, he doesn't need temples or, he's like huge. I mean, he can do whatever he wants. Like, he gives an image of a transcendent, a God who's like big and powerful and beyond us. And then after he makes that point, he switches gears and says, you know what? This big, powerful God, it's not like he's far, far away and we have no idea who he is. He's actually very close to us. He's very intimate with us. Kind of sounds good, doesn't it? I mean, it sounds kind of biblical, doesn't it? A God who's creator of heaven and earth, who's all powerful, and yet a God who, well, we can call him our Father. I mean, and so forth. So those are at least two big parts of Paul's sermon. And then guess Paul does. He does something he would never ever do in a sermon to unbelieving Jews. Unbelieving Jews, if they want to be convinced of the gospel, they want to know about its connection to the Old Testament. They want to know about what about the Messiah we're waiting from, right? What's that? I mean, a sermon to Jews, you better bring in the Old Testament with quotes, right? Okay? And that's what Paul does. But wait a minute, if you're on the Areopagus, and you're on Mars Hill, you're preaching to the pagans, I mean, the last thing you would do is quote from they don't know what's the Old Testament, okay? They have no idea. And so what does Paul do? He's very clever. He quotes from not one, but two pagan writers, right? These are sayings that people of that day know. I mean, that makes sense, right? So Paul's very clever. He can use pagan sources to kind of support his point. I'm just going to go a little faster because I have to watch the time. Anyway, then Paul gets, everything has been good so far. He had the hook. You guys are very religious. Oh, then he has the unknown God, okay? He's big and powerful. Notice he doesn't mention names or anything about Jesus yet, okay? And he's very intimate. All sounds very good. But here, finally, toward the end, Paul gets a little bit more, uncomfortable for the audience. Because he says, in the past, God overlooked this stuff. But now he commands people everywhere to repent. So now, I guess a little dicey, because repent means you're doing something wrong and you got to change your behavior, right? And so forth. And wait a minute, he's going to judge the world. Wait a minute, that doesn't sound good. And he's going to do it with the man he has appointed. Notice he hasn't mentioned the name Jesus yet. Well, I better watch I better watch it because I do want to have time for it. So actually we are all right. So remember the third part, we have the first part, the setting, 6 verses. How did Paul get to Athens? He's by himself, sees all the idols. He's attacked by these 2 groups of philosophers, right? They give a derogatory comment, a dangerous comment, okay? Then we had the sermon, the 10 verse of the sermon, and now finally we have the 3 verses that kind of end the story. Because the audience wants to know, is the gospel going to make it in Athens or not? Because if it makes it in Athens, remember it can make it anywhere. And we want to know, is it going to make it in Athens or not? Well, let's see. We read, when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. Pardon my alliteration again. Some were contemptuous and others were curious. Contemptuous or curious. First of all, the contempt crowd. And it has to do with the resurrection. They were tracking with Paul, right? They're nodding their heads. I mean, this guy's pretty good. He's got some interesting things to say. But as soon as he mentioned the resurrection of the dead, they suddenly changed. Why? Well, I think that if you're an Orthodox Christian who believes in the resurrection of the dead, right? Actually, the surprise or the weirdness of the resurrection maybe you've missed. I don't know if you've ever had this. I remember I grew up in a Christian home, like a really Christian home. Okay, I went to church not just once every Sunday, but like twice. Okay, because that's what we do in Christian Reformed circles. Anyway, somewhere around like 11 or 12 or something. I mean, also, by the way, the Apostles' Creed, ever heard the Apostles' Creed? We always said that every week because there's a line in there that says, I believe in the resurrection of the dead. I mean, I said that, like, okay, right? But somewhere around 11 or 12 years old, it was like, I thought people just kind of died and went to heaven and played harps for the rest of the eternity, right? Okay, but resurrection of the dead, that means that bodies are going to come out of the... That sounds weird or strange. I mean, that sounds like, these cheesy movies that we had in the past. I don't know what... I never watched them, okay? But, skeletons come around. I mean... And if you can think about that, that gives you a little bit of how crazy, how nonsense this sounded to good Greeks. Because, Greeks said that the body, physical, is kind of bad, but the soul or spirit is okay, right? So when you die, your soul maybe live forever. There are different kind of Greek philosophies. We don't have time to talk about that. But the idea of your body coming back to life again, that sounds like crazy, stupid talk. And you see that in Acts, right? I mean, the Areopagus, the highest court of the land in Athens, are all listening to Paul, okay, until he gets to the resurrection of the dead. And what do? A bunch of them sneer, right? They're contemptuous. They're like, that's stupid talk. I mean, okay, Paul, now I've wasted my time. I mean, I thought you were onto something, but I've had enough, okay? Boom. However, not everybody was contemptuous. There are other people who were curious. We read about others who said, Paul, you're saying some interesting things. We'd like to hear more for you. And so apparently Paul did come back and did give more. And we know that because he left the council, but we read this. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus. And you're supposed to go, ooh. Because remember, the Areopagus is highest kind of adjudicating body in Athens, the most prestigious place. So actually, other than one other convert, some of you may know this guy on the first missionary journey, Epicureans. This is, I think, the second most powerful, second most prestigious convert Paul ever had in his life, at least that we know of. So wow. A member of the Areopagus didn't just want to hear Paul and hear more, that he became a Jesus follower. Wow. Oh, and Luke, some of you know, Luke is concerned about a group of people, like marginalized people, right? I mean, in the Gospel of Luke, it's the parable of the Good Samaritan, okay, right? Marginal people. And maybe you know from Luke, Luke spends a lot of time, especially on women, okay? And so it's not surprising that in this story, too, Luke goes out of his way to highlight a woman convert. I mean, you've got Dionysius, the paradigm, the example male convert, and we also have, we don't know who she is, but the fact that she's mentioned by just her name, not by her husband's name or family name, suggests that she was a powerful figure. We have a second person, Damaris, and a number of others. And so, did the gospel make it in Athens, yes or no? It did, right? And if the gospel can make it in Athens, it can make it anywhere. That's right. Last week, Brother Ed was not with us, with Beth, Ed, and he asked a question, something like, what is the takeaway? So 3 takeaways, and we have time for a comment or question. So I'm saying to you, you've heard the gospel, right? Not just tonight, but in the church and maybe all kinds of other opportunities. You've heard the good news of the gospel, and the question is, what is your response, right? Are you contemptuous? A lot of people are. I mean, they think that the gospel is stupid talk. I mean, you believe that stuff? It's like a fairy tale. I mean, you believe miracles. You believe Jesus was the Son of God. You believe in the resurrection. I mean, you check your brain at the door. It's stupid talk. Come on. A lot of people are contemptuous. I mean, the values of the Christian faith, you believe that? You don't think this is possible or permissible? You're a bigot. Right? A lot of people respond with contempt. Other people are curious. I mean, we're happy for that. I mean, they're intrigued by the Christian gospel. They're open. But, if it doesn't go beyond that, I don't know how healthy it is. And so then I ask the third question, right? Or are you committed? Has the Holy Spirit, remember, actually the Holy Spirit is the author of the book of Acts, as we've said. It's not the Acts of the Apostles, the Acts of God, or more particularly, the Acts of the Holy Spirit. Has the Holy Spirit worked in your heart in such a way that you've heard the gospel and it's kind of took, right? I mean, it's kind of embedded in who you are. Are you committed? Well, brothers and sisters, look at that. I have 9 minutes for comments or questions. The most we've had on any week, right? And so, of course, that's only good if you're willing to make your way over to the microphone and to make a comment or a question. And so the floor is open in the little bit of time that we have left about the gospel coming to Athens.
Thanks, Jeff. Great talk. Question is, the other 3 places we're visiting, there's letters from Paul after his visit. To my knowledge, there isn't one for Athens.
Yes.
Why would that be?
That's a good question. And I didn't highlight that because it takes a little bit away from the point I was trying to make. In other words, did the gospel make it in Philippi? The answer is, yeah. And so much so that Paul wrote them a letter, okay, right? And did the gospel make it in Thessalonica? The answer is, yes, so much so that he wrote them a couple letters. Did the gospel make it in Berea? According to Acts, it did, right? Even though we have no letter. So we have to be careful, right? I mean, there may have been a letter, but we don't have it, right? And then next week, will the gospel make it in Corinth? I give it away. The answer is yes, although there are all kinds of complexities. And so it is true that in the early church, there are references to Christians in Athens, but on the other hand, maybe it's not surprising because I told you which is the bigger city, Athens or Thessalonica, in terms of actual size and so forth. Thessalonica. Which is the bigger city, Athens or Corinth? Okay? So, maybe, it's hard to know, right? It's an argument from silence. But, so the gospel made it in Athens, but we don't have much information about the small newbie Jesus followers in Athens, right? What happened to Dionysius and Damaris and others that are mentioned, yeah. You were going to ask a question, please?
A little bit off topic, but curious. Are people in Greece still worshiping the multiple gods? Are there a sect like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So actually, in Greece is 98.5% Greek Orthodox. 98.5%. That's pretty high. okay? So if you go to almost any Greek and you just say, are you a Christian? We'll say, of course I am. I'm Orthodox, okay, right? Now, I have to balance that. I don't mean to be critical, but the trouble is Greek Orthodox has become intimately connected with being Greek. When I say Greek, I mean just like ethnically, culturally, okay? So to be Greek is to be Greek Orthodox. So much so that if you're an evangelical in Greece, right, if you're not even the 1.5%, because that 1.5%, right, 100% minus 98.5 leaves 1.5. That includes Muslims, aren't many. That includes, cults of different kinds. So if you're one of that little tiny itty-bitty evangelical group, right, okay, and you're not Greek Orthodox, even though you're Greek, right? Greek Orthodox people will look at you like we would look at a Mooney or somebody from a cult, right? And even worse, because are Greeks kind of proud of their heritage, yes or no? They are. I mean, my big fat Greek wedding, I mean, it's over the top, but I mean, Greeks are like really proud of their, okay? And so they're not just annoyed, they're like angry almost at someone who's Greek Orthodox, because to not be Greek, I don't know if I said that right, to not be Greek Orthodox means that you're not Greek. I mean, you may speak Greek, you may have a Greek name, but in our minds, you're not Greek. Because if you were Greek, you would be Greek Orthodox, right? Most Greeks are named after a saint. Most Greeks are named after a saint. So you've got 2 birthdays every year. You have your birthday, the day that you were born, okay, right? But you also have whatever day your saint is, right? Because every saint has a special day. So, I mean, see? What I'm trying to show you is there's this intimate link between Greek Orthodoxy and Greek social life. So if you're an evangelical and you say, how do you do evangelism in Greece? Right? You go to a Greek Orthodox and say, let me tell you about the gospel. Well, you start going, they're like, I already know that story. I've heard that already. We hear that in our public schools, okay, because it's such a big thing. Am I getting a little bit at what is that, all right? So, yes, there are some genuine, sincere Greek Orthodox people, but vast majority, right? I mean, they never go to church except on Easter and those other, there are certain cultural days, right? So, I could say more, but, it's interesting, it's complicated, right? To get a little more specific about those things.
I'm just curious, you were talking about the fact that you take a lot of tours to Athens and Greece, and we went there, and we were at the Areopagus, and there was a rock right by that edifice. Uh-huh. Supposedly that was where Paul addressed these people. Uh-huh. The rock was so smooth you could hardly get up there.
Yeah.
But you're talking it might have been at the Agora. Yeah. So where do you... I mean, this is probably very important, but I'm kind of curious.
Yeah. Well, I hate to dash these romantic, experiences, okay? So the truth is, tour guides, not just in Greece, almost any country, right? Many of whom who really don't know the Bible very well or anything, right? But, they've led tours before, and they've discovered that if they say, this is the rock where Paul stood, people go like, you know what I mean? And they get their picture taken over there, and they want to touch the rock, and they say, I better tell the next tour group about that, okay? But if you're an egghead professor, okay, who's kind of concerned about accuracy and details, right? Sometimes I have to say, I hate to tell you that, but almost certainly that wasn't the case for A, B, and C reasons, okay, right? So there are this happens a number of times on these trips, okay? And sometimes we could speak with more clarity than others. So the problem is the archaeological evidence, is not much for that being a place. Remember I said to you the Areopagus is both a place and a thing, right, okay? And so the whole question is because Paul obviously met before a group of people, right, a council, where were they located? And it's kind of hard to have them located over there, just in terms of archaeological, right? And we have other evidence that Socrates, for instance, Socrates was tried in the Agora down below, right? And so those are at least just a couple of suggestions which it's more likely to envision it there. I'm not bothered by that, okay? Whether it happened up there in the Areopagus, who cares? The important thing is it happened. And I've got literary evidence and archaeological evidence that it's historical and real. You see? So I just don't think that way, right? It's not like I'm superstitious and there's like power in this rock. I'm going to Sedona in a couple of days. That's the vortex, okay? We got to be right there, and okay. So, but that's not how I think mature Christians should view the situation. We are certain about lots of other things, so don't get me wrong, right? So just try not to be too crushed, okay, by that.
I've heard people talk
Closer, please.
about a Greek Orthodox program in Athens where they collected the very early text of the New Testament in Greek. Have you had any experience with that? And I've heard that they have quite a few first century texts. Is that a legitimate thing? Or?
No, yes and no. So, okay. So, well, we're interested in any New Testament manuscript, okay? So, I mean, anywhere in the world where there is one, I mean, there are Christians who are interested in these texts. So, I have no doubt that there's an institute in Athens, where in monasteries in particular, maybe from around Greece, right, there are manuscripts that are very, very old, okay? For sure, they don't have one from the 1st century because the oldest manuscript we have of the New Testament is the 3rd century. So, unless there's like a super spectacular find that no one's ever said anything about. Anyway, so I know it's not 1st century, but so I'm just teasing you a little bit. But so the 3rd century is the oldest we have, and we have a number from the 4th century and tons from, as it goes on and so forth. And a lot of the manuscripts come from Egypt because, hot, dry climate, they're able to survive and last that long, right? A lot of manuscripts are collected in monasteries all around the Mediterranean, right? Because there are monasteries in Egypt and, there are Christians everywhere in the early. So there are a lot of manuscripts that end up in British libraries. And so they all have different names. They didn't come from there originally, but they ended up over there. So it's a fascinating field. It's called the field of textual criticism. Textual criticism. All the manuscripts, the thousands of manuscripts that have been uncovered, the oldest ones in Greek, other ones in Latin and in Coptic and in Syriac, and how do you collect them all, and how do you kind of make sense of their dating, and which one, this is a complicated but a very serious discipline called textual criticism, which lies behind the New Testament text I have. So what you have to do is you have to invite me back another time and say something like, how did we get the Bible, and you have to separate between the New Testament and the Old Testament because there's a different story behind both. But anyway, yes.
Maybe you could help. I'm confused a bit about Paul's leadership style. He went alone some places. He took younger people sometimes. He wrote I, me, my, and then he wrote we. Talk to me about his leadership.
Yeah, so we had this conversation a little bit beforehand, right? So I can't make it as long as I said earlier because our time is short. So there isn't like a passage that, Paul was this kind of leader or something, right? And the Bible wasn't written, right? It wasn't like, the Bible was written so that you would know good leadership models or something like that. Nevertheless, we can look at stories and events and then maybe derive from that some conclusions. So some of this is what I said to you earlier. So it's not hard to find a couple of negative examples. The classic one being at the end of the first missionary journey, Paul and Barnabas, who were like this, suddenly were like that, right? I mean, remember the big split. And you can find other places where Paul seems kind of strong and heavy-handed. And if you want to paint a negative picture of Paul, you can, right? But you need to balance that a lot, right, by a lot of other things. And, where there isn't a conflict or where Paul seems kind of wise in handling things. You rightly talked about how, for instance, in one of Paul's letters, or two of his letters, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, a lot of times Paul says, we did this and we did that, we did this and we did that. And a lot of people like to believe that means that it wasn't just Paul, but it was Paul, Silas, and Timothy. It was like a kind of equal leaders, and they're all sharing, right? And it sounds good, but as you rightly point out, there are at least 5 places, 3 in the first letter and 2 in the second, where instead of saying we, Paul says, I said this and I said that. And in strategic places, which suggests that the we is not so much we, right, but it's I. I mean, pastors do that sometimes, right, on the pulpit, right? A pastor can sometimes say, we here at Valley, da-da-da-da-da-da, and, it isn't, sometimes it's we, you and me, right, and sometimes it's me. I mean, anyway, those are some of the things we have to kind of think about. So I know there are lots of other texts. And I gave you another powerful image of Paul, like a breastfeeding mother and so forth. I just think you have to be careful. Yes, Paul was strong and so forth, but he also could be quite caring and compassionate. Now, we're out of time, but since you're standing there and you're such a nice person, I have to say, okay, one more question.
One more question. This is another curiosity one. When we were in Greece, we noticed that there seems to be a lot of superstition, and I'm guessing that that has kind of permeated this Greek Orthodoxy that's there. I mean, people standing in line to kiss the glass next to somebody's,
Yeah.
or traditions. Is this kind of like the Jewish thing with the traditions and additions?
Well, I'm a little bit hesitant because I have to be careful not to be perceived as being too critical. So from the outside, it looks highly superstitious, you know what I mean? I've got to go to church and buy a candle and, put some money in for the candle and light it over there and then go to the image of, and there are different biblical figures of images, and they have tons of saints, right? Like, along the years, many of who were killed and martyred, and you venerate by kissing, right? And so forth. And if you talk to a more mature Greek Orthodox, they would say, no, we're not worshiping this person, but we're we're honoring God somehow for what God did in and through that person, right? But I'm afraid to say that bleeds over into a kind of good luck, superstitious, go through the motions. And so that's where we get into problems, right? And on my tour, so I bring my group to an evangelical church, but the pastor is Greek. And the pastor comes from a Greek Orthodox background. So he speaks with some authenticity, he can talk about the Orthodox Church, and he's very gracious. Because these are his people, his fellow nation, right? So he wants to win them over, and so he's not insensitive or critical, but he will highlight, if you ask what's the difference between an Orthodox and a Reformed person and that kind of thing. Another one is tradition. A big thing is tradition. Just one little vignette. If you go to the island of Patmos, for instance, okay? Island of Patmos where John was, okay? You're walking into the cave where John supposedly received the revelation, and there's an icon on front, and there's John, but there's another person with him. Okay? Now, if you're an evangelical Christian, you know who John is, okay? He's one of the disciples, likely the author of Revelation, but you're wondering, who's this other guy, right? Okay, right? Well, if you're Greek Orthodox, you know exactly who it is. You know that it's Procurus, right? How do you know that? Because church tradition has said that John wasn't alone. He had a secretary with him, and they know his name, and he recorded all the revelations that they have. You won't find that anywhere in the Bible, but it will be in church tradition, right? But they don't separate the two. To them, it's all the same, right? Okay? So that's another big difference between, what does the Bible actually say, and then what has tradition claimed, and they bleed those things together, and tradition is just as important as others. So anyway, of course, there are other doctrinal issues and so forth. But in answer to your question, you have to nuance a little bit between a Greek Orthodox theologian's definition of what happens, which would be more noble and pop, right? From the common person, right? Who probably is doing it in a way that doesn't really match what that noble thing is, okay? Thank you. Actually, I have to be fair. If you ask what the Protestant faith is, right? You could say, well, are you talking to a pastor or theologian who will define it? Or are you talking to a person in the pew who may well have slipped into a kind of legalistic works, right? So the same kind of tension. Anyway, thank you for your time and attention. Oh, you're here. I feel like I'm getting in the hook because I'm getting the time.
You're coming back next week.
I'm coming back next week. Week number 4, the gospel comes to Corinth, okay? And so please come again and invite others, and I look forward to seeing you then.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah, we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.